Well, welcome to the Work Camping with Why Not Wonder podcast. We're here today with Heather from the Tax Queen, and we're excited to have her on because she's the expert with all things taxes and full-time RV life and work camping. And I actually found you from a magazine article right here and have just really enjoyed learning from you. I'm kind of a dork when it comes to enjoying this kind of stuff. I would love to hear your story about how you became a full-time RVer and tax queen and all of that.
Sure. So my husband and I started the journey to full-time RV in 2016, and we hit the road full-time with our two dogs. I was doing taxes already, but I was doing them for stationary people. I left that. I quit having an office. That's what I like to say. And I lost some of my clients. And I knew as we were traveling and I started meeting other, especially younger working, RVers, that they were struggling with taxes and issues like that, multiple states, all of that. And I said, well, here are my clients, right? I'm meeting my clients. And so that's sort of how I pivoted and became focused on RVers and traveling. And I really spent time learning multiple states and all these different rules, taking the RV, all of that. And now my husband and I are part-time. So we did 5 years full-time on the road, and we are part-time now. So we can start doing some international travel. So we have a home base and we can leave all our stuff behind and go abroad for 3 to 6 months out of the year. So
That's very cool.
Yeah, that's awesome.
We're going to just dive right in with questions for you, if you're good with that.
Yeah, thanks for having me on here.
Absolutely. So as far as work camping goes, can you explain the difference between working as a W-2 employee for a campground or other work camping employer versus working as a 1099 contractor?
The difference is basically you own a business. So if you 1099 a contractor makes you a small business owner, lets you take expenses and other things against that income. I rarely see a work camping where it should be a 1099. I guess that's, to me, some of the legal aspect behind it. If an employer can dictate your hours, when you work, where you work, and they give you the tools necessary to do that job, you really are a W-2 employee. And I find this to be a mistake made many times. If you can't dictate your own hours, then you are a W-2 employee, and it's worth it to push back. So.
That's interesting to know. So when we worked in Florida, he worked as a W-2 employee and I worked as a 1099 contractor. And it was for the same place,
Yeah.
but he had set hours and I was able to set my own hours. So,
okay.
So that would equal.
That sounds legitimate then.
Okay.
But they provided everything. They provided all of the supplies, everything she needed. It really just comes down to she could set her own hours. That's really the difference in the two.
But probably would have said you're still a W-2 employee, but
really
can't go back. Yeah. So if they provide your tools, if they're like dictating what you're doing, kind of, the time isn't necessarily, it's just one component. And it's something I give as an example because a lot of people work, the campgrounds or the place is going to offer you, right, 1099. And then they're going to say, oh, well, you have to come in between 9 and 1 because this is when we're going to have you in our, office or whatever to answer the phones or something like that. Or we need you to do maintenance and mow the lawn and whatever else. And we're going to give you the lawnmower and all that stuff. That's a W-2 employee. Yeah. It doesn't matter if you don't have to mow the lawn every Monday at 9 a.m. You might be able to mow it whenever, you have time. But it's still a W-2 employee.
Interesting.
Now, just to ask another question on this, is that something we should have pushed back on? Do we have a legal right to tell the employer, well, you really need to make us a W-2, not a 1099 employer or employee?
Yeah. I've had clients come to me and I will have them push back on a request like that, or they might just not take it because, obviously in your case, we're going back in time. You can't do that. But if they come to me prior, they might not take the work because it's just a sign, I don't know, that you might be used and abused or whatever, that it's not the good fit, and they're not doing it's actually by the state. It's mandated by the states that if you're a W-2 employee, you have to have unemployment insurance and liability and like all of that stuff. And a lot of times places don't want to provide all that. And so if they just 1099 you, that's easier. And they just pay you and you have to handle the taxes. And that's part of the issue, right? When you're a 1099, if that's the first time this is happening and you now have a small business, you're responsible for all of your self-employment tax, which is your Social Security and your Medicare. And that can be a big deal because you're really not making enough to cover that extra amount.
Very true. Yeah, we found that. Thankfully, we knew about it from former experience with businesses and stuff. So we knew about making estimated payments and all of that. But it's definitely something that's important to remember if you're going to do 1099 is that you need to make sure that you're working with a professional so that you do make those estimated payments and don't get in trouble come tax time.
And no surprise, right? So you might have worked and earned your money and saved it or put it aside or spent it on things, and now you don't have the cash to make that tax payment. So
yes. So something we never thought about when we became work campers was needing to file non-resident state tax returns in each state we worked in.
Okay. Yeah, that's the other thing we could touch on. So depending on what state it is that you're working in, you don't if you earn income there, then you have to file a non-resident. That is correct. And the same thing, it can be multiple states. So I've seen people, hey, I'm a Texas resident, and then I'm going to go work in New York for the summer, or Minnesota or Montana because it's nice and cooler there, something like that. And yes, you owe state tax.
So something that I read in this article this morning that was interesting that I didn't remember reading the first time was you wrote, the last factor is the amount of time spent in one state. If you spend more than half the year in one state, then you may need to file a resident tax return. This is sometimes called a statutory resident. Look up state laws or get help from a tax professional if this might apply to you.
So yeah, spending more than 6 months can constitute you as a resident. Sometimes it's 183 days depending on the state, but as a work camper, I mean, it depends, usually they do keep it to 5 months. So you are under that amount, but you're still physically earning like income in that state. So okay. It's the same or similar situation as a traveling nurse that might work a 6 or 12-week contract in a state at a specific hospital. I've had, traveling electricians, other tradesmen, or even like engineer if you physically are going onto a site to do the work.
Okay. Just another reason to work with somebody who knows what they're doing. These are all things that, I mean, when we hit the road, we truly were not thinking about any of this stuff. And when it came tax time, thankfully, the guy that we've worked with for years here was really knowledgeable about all that. And so when we gave him all of our tax stuff, he's like, oh, you got multiple state tax returns this year. And we were both like, what? Like, it never even crossed our minds.
Yeah. So as the difference too, like as a W-2 employee, they'll usually withhold enough because you're making a smaller amount, depending on, what your actual industry is or whatever, what you're doing for work. And it usually will cover, especially as a non-resident. But there are cases, I've had someone actually that a work camper in Colorado, and they were not Colorado residents, and they ended up owing, $52 to the state of Colorado, which was a surprise, and they didn't really like it. Thankfully, it's not a lot of money, but it was still a surprise. So it can happen.
So just to follow up on one more question with the statutory resident, what qualifies that? Is it, and I want to make sure I heard you correctly, is it your amount of time working for any companies? Maybe it's multiple companies as long as it's 6 months or more, or is it just working for one employer for 6 months or more?
It doesn't matter if it's one employer or 10 employers. If you spend that time, like 190 days in a state, then you could be considered a resident, even if it's for multiple employers.
Okay. Just wanting to clarify that. Thank you.
Yeah.
So one other thing our tax advisor made us aware of when we filed our taxes that first year was reciprocal states. Can you explain a little bit more about that and anything that potential work campers might need to know?
Sure. So neighboring states. So I'm trying to think of an example off the top of my head. Gosh, I can't there aren't that many I see reciprocal because of RVers are typically like either north and then they're like a Texas or Florida or even South Dakota residents, but neighboring states. So like let's just say New York, New Jersey, they might say, okay, well you paid your tax to New Jersey, so you don't owe us here in New York. But I rarely see that for people that are traveling, because that's really more for residency. So if you were a New York resident and drove over the border every day and worked in New Jersey, they might give you a break because you pay your tax to New Jersey or something. But as a traveler, I don't see that very often.
I can't remember what our case was, but I remember it happened. And so
Sure.
um I don't know if it was the Montana Michigan thing. I don't know. But so are you saying like neighboring states like close to each other? That's what.
It's typically neighboring states. So, especially when there's cities or something on the borders, so they have a lot of residents from one state will travel over the border into the other. So that's when they start to see reciprocal. The other thing that you might have run into is for example, I'm a Colorado resident. If I pay taxes to another state, so like let's say I spent 6 months or something in Montana working for somebody else, I would pay taxes to the state of Montana, and the state of Colorado was going to give me a credit for those taxes paid. So they call it taxes credit or taxes paid to another state, a credit for that. So like, let's say I spent $1,000, with Montana. Now Colorado is going to reduce my income tax by $1,000 because I technically already paid taxes on that income. And it's really to reduce double taxation among states.
Yes, that's exactly what we had.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we've had a few people ask us about deducting expenses for RV life.
Sure.
We've never considered anything as a deductible expense because we look at this as our choice, our lifestyle choice.
Yes.
So why would we be able to deduct campground costs or RV costs or RV insurance? What do you say to that?
I agree with you that it's a lifestyle choice. But there are situations, so part timers. So if you keep a home base somewhere, and you really are using, like you have proof that you can show you're using that RV for work purposes, and it happens. Um, that's really the case, is that the burden of proof is on you to show that you are using that vehicle or that RV or whatever for business or work purposes only. And it's a very gray area, right? Because if you live in a vehicle, a van, whatever, RV, you're going to sleep, you're going to eat in there, you're going to do recreational things, right? So it's very hard to say a lot of times that any RV use is 100% business. The exceptions I see when you have, if we're specifically talking about RVing, if you have a toy hauler and that back garage space is maybe set up as a studio or an office, and the same thing if you have a bunkhouse. So a bunkhouse where that's that extra bedroom, or many people might use it for children to sleep in. Some people use it as an office. And again, I say studio space because I've seen like artists or photographers that might use that, beyond just like a desk, right? Because you might need maker space. So that in those cases, but it's so small, like to take a home office in there, it's such a small space, and it doesn't give you a ton of benefit. I mean, some people say anything is better than nothing, which I agree with, but sometimes it's like it's $50. Like, is it worth raising that red flag?
Absolutely. If you're like us, you might be dreaming about full-time RV life, but feeling like it could never happen for you. If you'd like to receive our 3 secrets to becoming a full-time RVer ASAP, go to whynotwonder.com/secrets and enter your email address, and we will send it right to your inbox. Is there ever a time where you can deduct these things as a work camper? Say we're traveling from one job to the next, which is maybe 1,000 miles. Are we able to deduct any travel expenses?
No, because that's your choice to take different jobs across the country. Really, that's labeled as a commuting expense, and the commuting is never deductible. And that's that whole, like we were talking about, if you're in a state, right? So that changes your tax home. So if you drive from New York to Montana, you are now changing your tax home from New York to Montana, and that's a commuting thing. That's not a business. The only time I've seen it is if like you're going to meet with a client, or you're going to attend a conference. And really the travel expense part of it should be a duplication. That's how the IRS kind of explains it. If you're duplicating expenses, so you're leaving a family member or family members behind, you're creating an extra expense for housing, right? So you're staying in a hotel or an Airbnb, and you're leaving whatever else is behind with your spouse or your kids. That's when you start to be able to take expenses. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. And that's very, very helpful to know, because we have had a lot of people come to us and say, do you guys deduct mileage? Are you able to find any ways around this tax stuff? And we're like, no. I mean, we don't touch any of that. We look at it overall. This is our lifestyle choice. We have to accept the expenses for it.
And I think it's an awesome lifestyle choice. So I think it's worth it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I guess other examples, kind of just using myself. So I now have a home base and in Colorado, and I have attended, some conferences. I've been asked to speak or something. And so a lot of times I take that mileage because now I'm leaving, right? I'm duplicating my expenses. I'm leaving that home behind, which I plan to return to, whether it's in 6 months or in 6 days, it doesn't matter. I'm still returning there. And I might sometimes leave my spouse behind to go to that conference. So, and that's why I say it's situational. And if a full-timer versus a part-timer, keeping a home base somewhere is sometimes worth it if you're going to be driving a lot of mileage and you can really prove it. The other thing to be aware there is to always keep a mileage log. So the dates you were traveling, why you were traveling, who you were, meeting with, or what, if you're attending a conference, what that event was, just to really keep proof and records. And the reason why I say that is because I don't remember, what I ate for dinner last week, let alone why I was necessarily driving somewhere. So if we keep a log in a year from now or 2 years from now, if it gets questioned, I can just go back and say, oh, here's my log. Here's why I met to, with this person. And this was what, is a business meeting, or I attended a conference. And these are the dates and things.
So we kind of talked about someone running a business out of their home or setting up a studio or something like that. But what about if someone is working remotely from their RV? Are they able to deduct any expenses or no?
No, it doesn't. It's no different than someone working remotely from their house. They don't get to deduct anything. Usually I say if you're a W-2 employee and asking your employer for a stipend for working from home or working remotely, because a lot of times they will do that to help you with your internet costs or whatever it is. But if you're working for yourself, we just get to enjoy the freedom of working from anywhere.
Yep.
For sure. As far as remote work, somebody recently asked this, and I just thought it'd be great to bring to you. So say somebody's residency is in Florida, but they're working from Montana for a month, Idaho for a month. Do they have to file taxes in each of those states?
It really depends on the income that they're earning. So the states have a time period, right? We talked about that 6 months or 183 days, but they also have an income threshold. So if you're not meeting that income threshold, there's no need to worry about it. Again, if you're a W-2 employee, you're really your employer that should be concerned with that because of all the employment taxes that go along with it. But most of the time when I see travelers, I say, if you're a Florida resident, then you're working from Florida, and your employer doesn't need to know that you're in Montana or Idaho or New York or wherever. I've run into that case where some people have an employer that is nationwide and they are able to withhold taxes in all the states, and they ask them for a travel journal. So it happens. Yeah. Again, not a one size fits all answer, right?
But that's all I keep thinking through this entire interview is this just is so, it's just evidence for why you have to have somebody who knows what they're talking about. And in my opinion, not just anybody who does taxes. Like, you are so well versed in all of this, the moving around, the residency thing, the domicile thing, all of it is just, to me, it's very niche. And I don't know if that's true, but it feels like it.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I do get plenty of people that come to me for that reason, is because the person that they were previously using doesn't understand the lifestyle, doesn't understand how to deal with multiple states. Maybe they have deal with just some neighboring states or whatever, but I've filed in 33 states, I think, and counting. And 7 states don't have an income tax. So you do the math. And that's why, I mean, I niche down and really understand it, and we'll try to keep you legally in compliance with whatever the obligations are.
So are RVers eligible to receive tax credits or incentives for solar setups with their RVs, or is it similar to living in a sticks and bricks?
You can, if the RV is either a primary residence or a secondary home, you can definitely use the solar credit. That is definitely available.
That's so interesting. So we've been seriously considering a solar setup on our RV. So because it is our primary residence, we could potentially have the credit.
Mm-hmm. So the year that it starts working, and I say that because sometimes people will buy items for it November or December and have it installed in January or February, and so that you wouldn't be able to take the credit in, for that November. So like this year, let's say for 2024, but if your solar system started working in January or February of 25, that's the year you would take the credit, because that's the year it started working.
Interesting.
Now, I mean, that just brings to my mind the question of, does saying the RV is my full-time residence, does that create an issue with my residency on my ID shows Florida, but I'm claiming the RV? You see,
No, because the address for your residence is still Florida. Like, even though
and your RV
it might be a little box, right, that we get our mail in,
okay,
but it's still Florida.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay, just making sure to clarify that.
So we're talking federally that 30%. So it's 30% right now, federally solar, tax credit. I'm not talking about state tax credits. I'm just talking about federal.
Okay.
So do you see any recurring issues with RVers and taxes that we could make everybody aware of on the podcast? Just things to think about before they're hitting the road, because that's really who this podcast is for.
Oh, no, I mean, I really honestly reach out to your tax advisor. If you already have one that you trust, find one that you can trust to ask questions before you make changes, before you do things. I worked with many people in a transitional phase, whether they're working or they're retired, or maybe they're going to start work camping or something. And they just come to me, and I'm happy to answer questions to keep them on track and making sure that there's no mistakes and that we're going to have to correct. Sometimes they're very expensive if you make mistakes. So we don't want to do that. So that's my recommendation, is always just reach out, because as we've kind of already talked about here, everyone has unique situations going on. Maybe someone's selling a home, things like that, selling property that isn't their main residence. There's so many different things, and I can't go over all the variables, right? Because I can't predict them all.
Is there anything else that you think it's important to mention regarding taxes, RV life, work camping that we haven't covered in this?
Just being aware of expenses that you can take as business owners. I mean, I see a lot of people, we commingle our phone and we have multiple internet plans or whatever. So being able to take expenses like that and just understanding what is allowed is probably the biggest thing as a business owner. As a work camper, it's usually a little less, because you should be a W-2 employee most of the time. So you don't get to take those expenses, but understanding the expenses you can take.
And documenting, that's a big takeaway. That's a big takeaway I'm getting from this so far, is making sure you are documenting everything.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Documentation is really important.
Well, we would love to hear about the services that you offer at Tax Queen. How can people work with you, and just maybe explain? I think this entire podcast has explained the benefit of working with you.
Sure.
But you could just add to it.
Sure. So I obviously do tax preparation. So that is, filling out forms, whether that's with federal or state or both. I also am doing tax planning, so tax strategy. So especially for higher income taxpayers, being able to get the most and take all the deductions and things legally allowed for you, set your business up properly for the best tax savings, things like that. Those are really the best ways to work with me. But I also do one-on-one consultations. Sometimes someone just needs an hour to ask me some questions, and I'm happy to do that as well.
That's awesome. So how can people find you?
My website is the best way. It's tax-queen.com. I'm on social media, so you can find me on Instagram and Facebook, and I do some YouTube videos. Yeah. And I guess one more plug for that is I do Tax Tuesday. So it's a free, you can ask questions. I can submit them ahead of time, or you can just jump online and ask them live. So the first Tuesday of every month, I really like to give back to my community because these are my people, right? I'm a traveler too. So you can jump on there and ask a question and I will answer it the best way I can. Sometimes it's hard, again, because we've talked about, unique situations and stuff, but that's a really great way to just kind of get your feet wet and maybe just get a quick question answered.
What are your platform names?
Instagram, I think it's just Tax Queen, honestly.
That's okay.
Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, if they do a search just under Tax Queen, they can pretty much find you on all the platforms.
They should be able to find me, and my little logo is like kind of a diamond with a little queen on top, or a crown on top. So you'll know that it's my account if you see that. I think it's just Tax Queen on both of them. So yeah.
Well, I can vouch for those Tax Tuesdays because I've watched some of them. So very, very helpful.
It's a really great way. It doesn't cost you anything. And honestly, if you just tune in or watch the replays, you might learn something from somebody else's question.
Thank you so much for your time today, Heather. It has been wonderful to talk to you. We appreciate you sharing your expertise, and it's just been such a pleasure.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This is always fun to talk taxes.
Thanks so much for listening to the Work Camping with Why Not Wander podcast.
You can see today's show notes at whynotwander.com/podcast. And if you haven't done so already, please sign up to receive regular updates from us, along with special discounts at whynotwander.com/updates.